Amid the chaos that the Middle East has become in recent decades, a question echoes with growing intensity. Has it always been this way? Were Jews and Arabs destined to live in eternal conflict? Or was there a moment in history when another path was possible? The answer to this question lies buried in the yellowed pages of forgotten books and the dusty archives of universities. It has a name and surname: Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher who dared to dream of a different future for the Holy Land. While political leaders on both sides spoke of separation, conquest, and resistance, Buber proposed something that today sounds almost utopian: a state where Jews and Arabs would live as equals, building together a society based on dialogue and mutual respect. It was not naivete. It was philosophy applied to the harshest reality. Buber was not just a dreamer. He was a respected intellectual, a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, someone who knew both the sacred texts and the streets of Jerusalem. He lived through the birth of Israel, witnessed the first wars, felt firsthand the tensions that divided the region. And yet, he never gave up believing that a true encounter between the peoples was possible. Today, decades after his death, his ideas seem more distant than ever. But perhaps that is exactly why we need to revisit them. In an increasingly polarized world, Martin Buber's philosophy offers something rare: hope grounded in wisdom. This is the story of a man who believed in the impossible and never stopped fighting for it. A story that begins on the streets of Vienna at the end of the 19th century, with a restless young Jew who would ask uncomfortable questions for the rest of his life. Martin Mordecai Buber was born on February 8, 1878, in a Vienna brimming with contradictory ideas. It was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a cosmopolitan metropolis where Jews, Christians, Muslims, and atheists lived side by side, frequented the same cafes, and debated the same philosophical dilemmas stirring fin de siècle Europe. His childhood, however, was marked by an early rupture. When he was only 3 years old, his parents separated, something scandalous by the standards of the time. Little Martin was sent to live with his paternal grandparents in Lviv, Galicia, a region now part of Ukraine, but then a cultural melting pot of the empire. It was with these grandparents that Buber had his first deep contact with Jewish tradition. His grandfather, Salomon Buber, was a respected scholar, an expert in rabbinic literature and Jewish folklore. He was not just a religious man. He was an intellectual who could navigate between millennia-old tradition and modern currents of thought. This combination would leave a deep mark on his grandson. His grandmother, Adele, completed the family picture with her sensitivity to social and human issues. She showed young Martin that spirituality was not something abstract, but something manifested in care for others, attention to everyday life's details, and respect for the dignity of every person. At 14, Martin returned to Vienna to study. The city he found was a laboratory of revolutionary ideas. Freud was developing psychoanalysis, musicians like Gustav Mahler were breaking classical traditions, and Viennese cafes were the stage for heated debates on politics, art, and philosophy. It was in this vibrant environment that young Buber began to ask the questions that would accompany him throughout his life. How to reconcile tradition and modernity? Is it possible to be deeply Jewish without closing oneself off from the world? How to build bridges between different cultures and religions? At university, he studied philosophy and art, but his true education came through endless conversations with peers from diverse backgrounds. Buber had an insatiable curiosity about other ways of seeing the world. He read Kant and Nietzsche with the same veracity as he studied Hasidic texts. He frequented synagogues, churches, mosques, and Eastern meditation centers alike. This intellectual openness drew attention. Some colleagues saw him as a brilliant young man capable of original syntheses between different currents of thought. Others considered him scattered, unable to commit to a single tradition. Buber did not care about the criticism. Early on, he had understood something that would take years to articulate philosophically. Truth was not found in any isolated tradition, but in the genuine encounter between different perspectives. By the age of 20, He was already recognized in Viennese intellectual circles as a promising mind. He wrote essays, participated in public debates, and began to develop his first ideas on religion and society. But it was precisely at this time that something happened that would completely change the course of his life. His first contact with the Zionist movement. The year was 1898, and Theodor Herzl had just published The Jewish State, a pamphlet that would ignite the imagination of European Jewry. Throughout Europe, young Jews gathered in small groups to debate a revolutionary idea. What if Jews had their own country? What if they could stop being eternal strangers and finally become a normal people, with their own territory, government, and army? Martin Buber was captivated by this idea, but not for the reasons most would expect. While other young Zionists spoke of escaping anti-Semitism or building a safe refuge for the Jewish people, Buber saw Zionism as something completely different, an opportunity for spiritual renewal. He joined the movement, but was from the start seen as a peculiar figure. At the first Zionist congresses he attended, while others debated practical issues, where the future state would be, how it would be funded, what kind of government it would have, Buber asked uncomfortable questions. What kind of society do we want to build? What values will guide this new country? How do we ensure we do not repeat the mistakes of other nations? The difference between Buber and the main current of Zionism quickly became clear. Herzl and his followers advocated what they called political Zionism, a pragmatic movement focused on conquering territory and establishing state institutions. For them, having a country was the priority. The rest would be solved afterward. Buber, on the other hand, embraced what became known as cultural Zionism. For him, it was not enough to have a Jewish state. It was necessary to build a renewed Jewish culture, a society deeply rooted in tradition, yet radically open to the modern world. This vision led him to dive into the study of Hasidism, a Jewish mystical movement that had flourished in Eastern Europe. Hasidim were not only religious, they lived their spirituality intensely and joyfully, seeing the sacred in the simplest everyday activities. For Buber, they represented an alternative both to traditional Orthodox Judaism and to modern secularism. He began writing about the Hasidic masters, retelling their stories and teachings in a way that spoke directly to modern Jews. His early works on Hasidism caused a sensation. Jewish intellectuals across Europe discovered through Buber's texts a dimension of Jewish tradition they had completely overlooked. But Buber was not interested only in reclaiming the past. His true ambition was to apply Hasidic wisdom to the challenges of the present. And the greatest challenge, in his view, was precisely the construction of the future Jewish national home. While other Zionists saw Palestine as an empty land waiting to be colonized, Buber knew that other people already lived there, the Palestinian Arabs. And here, one of the most revolutionary and controversial ideas of his career began to take shape. What if, instead of expelling or subjugating the Arabs, the Jews tried to live together with them? This idea did not arise from cold political analysis, but from his deep understanding of Jewish spirituality. For Buber, Judaism was not only a religion or an ethnic identity, it was a way of relating to the world based on justice, compassion, and the recognition of the dignity of all human beings. If the Jews were returning to the Promised Land to build a truly Jewish society, Buber argued, then that society should reflect the highest values of the Jewish tradition, and that included treating the foreigners living among them with respect. It was a beautiful idea, but extremely unpopular. Most Zionists saw Buber's concerns about the Arabs as a dangerous distraction from the main goals of the movement. Some even accused him of naivety, of not understanding the political realities of the Middle East. Buber, however, was not naive. He was developing a sophisticated philosophy of human relationships that would soon become his most important contribution to modern thought. In 1923, Martin Buber published a small book that would revolutionize 20th century philosophy. Ich und Du, I and Thou, was less than 100 pages, but its ideas would resonate for decades in fields as diverse as psychology, theology, education, and international relations. Buber's genius lay in his radical simplicity. He proposed that there are only two fundamental ways to relate to the world: through the I-it attitude or through the I-thou attitude. In the I-it relationship, you treat what you relate to as an object. This is how you use a hammer, drive a car, or consult a book. You have a specific goal, use the object to achieve it, and then discard it. There is no reciprocity, no surprises, no true encounter. The it is there to serve your purposes. This attitude, Buber explained, is not limited to material objects. Unfortunately, it is also how we often treat other people. When you go to a bank and see the clerk only as someone who will process your transaction, when you talk to someone just to get something in return, when you look at a stranger on the street and reduce them to a category, young, old, rich, poor, you are establishing an I-it relationship. The I-thou relationship, on the other hand, is completely different. It happens when you recognize the other as a full subject, with their own interiority, their own experiences, their own mysteries. You cannot control or predict an I-thou relationship. It is always a genuine encounter between two subjectivities. Buber illustrated this difference with touching examples. You can look at a tree in two ways: as an it, noting its height, species, commercial value, usefulness for shade, or as a thou, entering into a kind of communion with its living presence, its silent history, its participation in the mystery of existence. With people, the difference is even more dramatic. When you truly look into someone's eyes and recognize they're not just a social role or function, but an inner life as rich and complex as your own, something extraordinary happens. For a moment, both cease to be objects to each other and become subjects in full encounter. For Buber, these moments of true I-thou encounter are rare and precious. Most of life takes place in the I-it world, and that is not necessarily bad. We need that attitude to function practically in the world. The problem arises when we completely lose the capacity to establish I-thou relationships, when we treat everything and everyone as objects for our manipulation. The philosophical influence behind these ideas was rich and complex. Buber had drawn from German Romanticism, especially thinkers like Johann Georg Hamann, who emphasized the importance of lived experience over abstract analysis. He was also deeply influenced by Søren Kierkegaard, who insisted on the primacy of the personal existential encounter with truth. But there was an even more important source, the Jewish mystical tradition. In Hasidism, Buber had found the idea that the sacred is not separate from everyday life, but reveals itself precisely through authentic encounters between people. Hasidic masters taught that each person carries a divine spark, and that our task is to recognize and honor that spark in others. This spiritual dimension of Buber's philosophy was not merely ornamental. For him, every genuine I-thou relationship was, in some sense, an encounter with the sacred. When you truly see another person as a thou, you participate in the fundamental mystery of existence, the fact that there are other consciousnesses in the world besides your own, other ways of experiencing reality. This philosophy had revolutionary implications for practically all areas of human life. In education, it meant treating students not as empty vessels to be filled with information, but as active subjects in the learning process. In psychotherapy, it meant seeing the patient not as a set of symptoms to be fixed, but as a whole person, seeking growth and healing. And in politics? Here lay the heart of Buber's radical vision. If authentic I-thou relationships can be established between individuals, why couldn't they be possible between groups, between nations, between peoples who see each other as enemies? Why couldn't Jews and Arabs recognize each other mutually as thou instead of eternally treating each other as it? It was a question that would soon be tested in the most dramatic way possible, when historical circumstances forced Buber to leave his academic life in Europe and face the brutal realities of the Middle East. The year 1933 marked the end of a time era for Martin Buber. With Hitler's rise to power in Germany, the Jewish intellectual life that had flourished for decades was brutally interrupted. Buber, then living in Frankfurt and directing the Freies Jüdisches Lehrhaus educational institution, suddenly found himself on enemy territory. The Nuremberg laws made it impossible for Jewish intellectuals to continue their academic activities. Universities closed their doors to Jewish professors, publishers canceled contracts, and what had been a life dedicated to thought and dialogue turned into a daily struggle for survival and dignity. For 5 years, Buber resisted. He continued, writing, giving clandestine lectures and trying to keep alive the flame of German Jewish culture. But in 1938, with Kristallnacht and the brutal escalation of persecution, it became clear that there was no place left for him in Europe. At 60 years old, Martin Buber packed his bags and left for Jerusalem. It was, ironically, the forced realization of a Zionist dream, but under circumstances he had never imagined. The arrival in Palestine was a profound culture shock. Buber had spent decades writing about the return to the Promised Land, but had done so from Viennese cafes and German libraries. The reality he found in Jerusalem was very different from his intellectual fantasies. The heat was suffocating, living conditions more primitive than he was used to, and the emerging Jewish society was far more pragmatic and less philosophical than he had expected. Many of the Zionist pioneers arriving in Palestine were interested in building farms, draining swamps, and establishing factories, not debating the subtleties of the philosophy of dialogue. Even more challenging was the reality of the Arab-Jewish conflict. At European universities, Buber could theorize about peaceful coexistence between peoples. In Jerusalem, he saw daily the real tensions between communities. Attacks, reprisals, mutual distrust, and hatred were part of everyday life. Buber secured a position at the Hebrew University as a professor of social philosophy. But even there, he faced resistance. His colleagues, mostly practical Zionists, viewed his ideas about Arab-Jewish coexistence as dangerously idealistic. Some even questioned his loyalty to the Zionist project. Personal adaptation was also difficult. Buber had lost not only his country, but also his language. His entire philosophical work had been written in German, a language now marked by Nazi persecution. In Israel, it was expected that he would write in Hebrew, a language he mastered academically, but had never expressed himself creatively in. Despite all these difficulties, Buber found in Jerusalem something he did not expect, a unique opportunity to test his theories in practice. For the first time in his life, he was living in a society where Jews were the majority, where they could make real political decisions, where they had the chance to build the kind of community they had always dreamed of. And it was precisely in this context that Buber began to articulate his most radical and controversial vision. If the Jews were finally creating their own state, what kind of state should it be? How should they treat the Arabs already living on the land? How to build a society that was genuinely Jewish in the best senses of the tradition? These questions were not merely academic. With rising tensions in the region and the approach of World War II, it became increasingly clear that concrete political decisions would have to be made soon. And Buber was determined to influence those decisions, even if it cost him popularity among the Jews themselves. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was met with jubilation by much of the Jewish people. After centuries of persecution culminating in the Holocaust, Jews finally had an internationally recognized homeland. It was the fulfillment of an ancient aspiration, deeply rooted in the collective soul. Hymns were sung, flags were raised. Thousands of Shoah survivors found refuge. But at the same time, more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were displaced or forced to flee in an exodus that would forever mark the conflict. Martin Buber then found himself facing a paradox. On one hand, he understood the vital importance of the birth of Israel. He knew that for a traumatized people, having their own state represented security, identity, and dignity. On the other hand, he saw with sharp clarity that something essential had been lost in this process: the principle of coexistence. The creation of Israel had come accompanied by the pain of another people, the people who already lived on that land. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Buber did not uncritically celebrate the founding of the state. He recognized it as necessary, but tragic. For him, Independence should not have come at the cost of the destruction of Arab villages, the expulsion of families, and the militarization of society. Buber then began a new phase of his intellectual life, prophetic criticism. His voice gradually became one of the few within the Jewish community, openly denouncing the injustices committed against the Arabs. He was not a politician, nor an activist, in the traditional sense, but his words carried the weight of someone speaking with moral authority. As a professor at the Hebrew University and a respected figure in the cultural scene, he used every opportunity to warn, the state of Israel cannot sacrifice its soul in the name of survival. In speeches and articles, he insisted, military victory is not an ethical victory. Lasting peace could only be born from mutual recognition, and that meant justice for the Palestinian Arabs. Even in the most difficult years, such as during the 1948 war or the tensions preceding the 1956 war, Buber publicly advocated for the restoration of civil rights to Arabs who remained in Israel, the return of confiscated properties, and a commitment to full citizenship. But he was a lonely voice. The new state was concerned with its survival, its institutional construction, its identity. Most political leaders viewed with suspicion any proposal that seemed to yield to the enemy. Many saw Buber as someone out of time, an idealist, disconnected from reality. Still, he did not retreat. He founded and participated in several initiatives aimed at Arab-Jewish dialogue. He welcomed Arab students into his home. He wrote open letters to the government, trying to influence public policies, always with the same message. There will be no security without justice, nor peace without recognition. His work during this period has something prophetic about it, in the biblical sense. He resembled the ancient prophets of Israel, who would not remain silent before the king, who denounced the idolatry of power, who called the people to moral responsibility. For Buber, Israel would only be faithful to its spiritual destiny if it could see in the Arab not an enemy, but a partner in building the land. In one of his most notable texts, written shortly after the founding of the state, Buber declared, "The true test of the state of Israel will not be its military strength nor its economic growth, but its ability to act justly toward those who dwell here with us." This sentence sums up his vision. The state is not an end in itself, but an instrument to realize values. And the supreme value for him was the ethical relationship between peoples, the I and thou, transformed into living politics. Over the years, Buber became increasingly skeptical about the direction Israel was taking. He viewed with concern the strengthening of militarism, the use of religion to justify exclusionary policies, the nationalism that denied the complexity of reality. But he never stopped loving the Jewish people, and he never stopped believing that another path was possible. It is remarkable how even in moments of greatest frustration he preserved hope. Buber was not a naive optimist but a man of faith in human possibility. For him, each generation has the chance to choose. Even when all seems lost, there is always the opportunity for reconciliation. Shortly before his death in 1965, Buber received honors and awards. Many respected him as a philosopher, but few listened to him as a critic. He died without seeing his dream realized. But perhaps this says more about his time than about the validity of his vision. Today, looking back, his words sound almost like a warning. He foresaw, decades earlier, that occupation, inequality, and closing off dialogue would lead us to a moral impasse. And perhaps, precisely because of that, his message is so necessary now. In the next chapter, we will see how that hope endured, and how Buber's vision continues to inspire those who still believe, against all odds, that Jews and Arabs can indeed be brothers of the land. Martin Buber died in 1965 at the age of 87, surrounded by academic respect, but not political influence. His critique of how Israel had been structured, and of the relationship between Jews and Arabs, was seen as beautiful but utopian. His name came to be revered in philosophical and educational circles, but his vision for the future of the Holy Land seemed to have been shelved in the past, and yet there is something profoundly alive in his legacy. He did not disappear, he only became less visible. In Israel's political practice, his proposal for a binational state became a minority view and even taboo. The conflict worsened over time, and the occupation of Palestinian territories after a while. 1967 made the idea of coexistence even more remote. In a polarized scenario where fear and resentment often guide decisions, proposals for deep dialogue sound like naivety. But outside official stages, Buber continues to inspire. His ethics of relationship, the one that invites the human being to see the other as thou and not as it, still echoes in grassroots movements, in alternative schools, in initiatives that quietly try to keep the flame of encounter alive. Organizations like the Parent Circle, formed by Israeli and Palestinian families who lost loved ones in the violence and yet still strive for reconciliation, are examples of Buber's spirit in action. They may not necessarily mention his name, but they embody his vision. It is in the face of the other, even the enemy, that the possibility of redemption begins. In universities, especially outside Israel, Buber is taught as a thinker who transcends his time. Dialogue philosophers, humanist educators, Christian and Muslim theologians all find points of convergence in his work. His influence is subtle but deep. He is read in ethics courses, in coexistence seminars, in interreligious projects. The idea that human relationship is the heart of reality has not lost its force. On the contrary, it may never have been more necessary. Within Israeli society itself, some educators continue trying to apply his ideas. Bilingual schools that bring together Arab and Jewish children have been slowly spreading. In places like the Hand-in-Hand School, students grow up learning 2 languages, 2 histories, and a third possibility, that of living together without denying their differences. These are small seeds, planted in hard soil, but seeds nonetheless. The Palestinian side, there are thinkers and activists who, even without direct reference to Buber, share the same dream, that of a land where justice and dignity are shared. The philosopher Sari Nusseibeh, for example, even proposed a federative vision similar to Buber's, something that goes beyond the binary of 2 states or 1 state, seeking a structure based on equal rights and mutual recognition. Buber also found new life in the digital era. With the globalization of thought, his work was rediscovered by young intellectuals looking for alternatives to contemporary cynicism. His quotes circulate on social media, especially in contexts of spirituality, education, and psychology. His language, simple yet profound, speaks directly to the heart of a generation tired of divisions and thirsty for reconnection. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of his legacy lies in what is neither institutionalized nor programmed, the simple act of seeing the other as a subject. In a society increasingly marked by bubbles, algorithms, and cancel culture, the ethics of the I and thou is a gesture of resistance. Seeing the other as someone with whom I can have a genuine encounter, not an enemy, nor a problem to be solved, but a person, is a silent revolution. Even in contexts far from Israel and Palestine, Buber reemerges. Community leaders, marriage counselors, therapists, religious figures, all at some level touch on the central idea he formulated, that the healing of the world begins in the way we relate, that the fate of politics, education, religion, and even peace depends on the quality of the human encounter. Of course, some say all this is little in the face of the brutal reality of facts. And perhaps it is. Buber was never naive. He knew the harshness of the world. But he also knew that human history is not written only by great treaties and wars. It is shaped every day by small acts of listening, respect, openness, and he believed in that with all his strength. Perhaps the greatest sign that his legacy still matters is the way it unsettles. The idea of a state for Jews and Arabs together still provokes deep resistance. And that is exactly what reveals its power. Because Buber does not offer us comfort. He offers us an ethical demand. He asks us, how far are we willing to go to see the other as an equal? And it is this question that keeps echoing, like a whisper, like a reminder, like a call. In the next chapter, we will explore exactly this: the seeds of the future born from this question, and how, even in dark times, Buber's vision can be a beacon for what is still to come. After understanding how Martin Buber's legacy remains invisible yet pulsating in today's complex reality, the next step is to look ahead, to the seeds of the future his philosophy planted even in barren soil. In times of growing global polarization, environmental crises, and prolonged conflicts, Buber's ideas offer a subtle but intense light on how we can rebuild human and social relationships. His thought is not a magic formula for peace, but an invitation to a way of being that can radically transform how we coexist. First, Buber teaches us that genuine dialogue is a tool for building, not destruction. In today's world, dialogue is often confused with cold negotiation or empty rhetoric. For Buber, dialogue is the authentic encounter between subjects, an exchange that does not aim to defeat the other, but to recognize them in their humanity. This implies deep listening, an effort to understand what the other is, not to use it against them. This principle may seem simple, but it is revolutionary when applied to conflict realities. In the Israeli-Palestinian context, for example, dialogue often gets lost in political strategies, national interests, and incompatible narratives. Buber, however, challenges us to look beyond these superficial layers, to try to build a bridge where the other's you is respected as legitimate. It is an invitation to humanize the enemy, to disarm the gaze that only sees threat. Moreover, Buber insists that true human encounter requires courage, the courage to expose oneself, to give up absolute certainties, to accept vulnerability. This does not mean weakness, but ethical strength. In a world where ideologies tend to be defensive and aggressive, the courage of dialogue is an act of resistance against dehumanization. Another valuable lesson from Buber for the future is the idea that lasting peace can only be built on the foundation of mutual respect and real equality. The binational state he envisioned, where Jews and Arabs would share equal rights, may seem distant, but this notion of fundamental equality should inspire any coexistence project. At present, even among those who advocate solutions like two states, real equality remains a constant challenge. Segregation, physical barriers, economic and social inequalities continue to fuel distrust and resentment. Buber's vision calls us to go beyond technical and administrative solutions and invest in transforming personal and social relationships. This means, for example, investing in education that promotes encounter, not just factual knowledge about the other, but the cultivation of empathy and recognition. Buber believed in the transformative power of education to form subjects who see the world through the other's eyes. This is a living legacy, especially for educators working in contexts of diversity and conflict. On the broader field of humanity, the philosophy of I and thou resonates with other currents that value intersubjectivity, ethics of care, and shared responsibility. This includes movements seeking social justice, environmental protection, and universal human rights. From this perspective, we can understand that peace and justice are inseparable from the quality of our everyday encounters. Furthermore, Buber inspires us to cultivate hope, not a passive hope, but an active one, rooted in the practice of encounter. He knew reality could be harsh and resistance great, but he also knew that all transformation begins in the present moment, in the gesture of opening oneself to the other. For those following developments in the Middle East, this hope may seem fragile, yet initiatives promoting interreligious dialogue, shared cultural projects, and bilingual social programs show that the seeds planted by Buber, even if tiny, continue to sprout. Moreover, his thought warns us of the dangers of radicalization and identity closure. In times of us versus them, his invitation is to break the vicious circle of fear and exclusion, seeking a new space where the other's you is not a threat, but a possibility. On a personal level, Buber's message can be applied in our daily relationships. Learning to see the other as a subject, with full attention and respect, can transform personal, family, and social conflicts. This ethics of encounter is universal and necessary in any context. Finally, what Buber offers us is an ethical challenge for the future. How can we practice authentic encounter in our lives, institutions, and societies? How can we transform politics, education, culture, and international relations from this principle? This question remains open, and it is here that each person can become part of the answer. Buber's legacy is not only in books or academic speeches, but in the daily practice of encounter. As we conclude this reflection, it becomes clear that his vision is less a recipe and more an invitation to reimagine the future as a space where dialogue, respect, and equality are not distant utopias but concrete realities. In the next chapter, we will close with a call to action, reflecting on how each of us can be an agent of this dialogue and possible peace, especially in the complex context of Israel and Palestine, and in the world as a whole. If Martin Buber's legacy has shown us that authentic dialogue and mutual respect are fundamental paths to peace, the question guiding us now is, what can we do today to turn these ideas into reality? The first step is to recognize that change begins with each of us in our daily attitudes. I and thou is not just a distant philosophical theory, it is a possible and necessary practice that we can apply in personal, professional, and social relationships. Learning to truly listen, without prejudice or hurry to judge, is an act of resistance against the culture of polarization and conflict. On a collective level, supporting initiatives of dialogue and peaceful coexistence, whether local or global, is a concrete way to contribute. Organizations promoting intercultural encounters, education for peace, and projects that unite different communities are practical examples of what Buber advocated. Engaging, volunteering, or even sharing these initiatives helps expand the reach of this applied philosophy. For those following the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, remembering Buber's vision is a way to strengthen hope and commitment to solutions that respect the dignity of all involved. Pressure for policies that guarantee equal rights and promote dialogue can come from ordinary citizens who follow and demand change from their representatives. Additionally, in the field of education, promoting teaching that values encounter with the other, empathy, and respect for diversity is essential to forming future generations better prepared for peaceful coexistence. Buber believed in the transformative power of education, and investing in it is investing in a different future. Finally, the broadest invitation left to us is to cultivate the ethical courage that Buber exalted. It takes courage to step out of comfort zones, to question dominant narratives, to open oneself to dialogue even when it seems difficult or dangerous. In today's world, where so many voices close themselves off in ideological trenches, Buber's call is a breath of humanity, an invitation to build bridges instead of walls, to see the other not as an enemy but as a partner on the common journey of life. If each one does their part, no matter how small it seems, we will be adding forces for a future where dialogue and peace can cease to be utopias and become part of our everyday life. Thus, Martin Buber's forgotten dream, the dream of an Israel and a world where I and thou is the foundation of relationships, can be rescued and reinvented by all of us. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue following content that brings deep reflections on Israel, philosophy, and hope for the future, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave your like to help strengthen this message and share it with friends and family who might also be inspired by Martin Buber's thought and the pursuit of peace. And, of course, leave your opinion in the comments. We really want to know what you think about this dream of dialogue and coexistence. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video.